Hi, my name is Bente, I'm the Norse Witch, and this is Skadi. And today I will cover a topic that I can't believe I haven't made a video on yet, and that is my 10 beginner witch tips. I kind of feel like this is like a rite of passage for every witchy content creator. Most people have done some kind of beginner tips video, and I can't believe I haven't made one yet. I realized that like half a year ago or something, but I also didn't want to like sit down and force 10 tips onto paper. So I just spent like the past half year writing everything down whenever something came up. With that being said, I hope if you are a beginner magical practitioner, then these will be helpful for you. And in case you are not a beginner anymore, feel free to give your tips in the comments. And with that being said, let us start. Okay, let us start out right away with my first tip, and that's actually something that I already made an entire video on, so if you're interested then you can watch that too. But this tip is: do not niche your practice down too fast. Don't look for a label right away, don't look for like this one specific practice that I want to do. First of all, nobody needs a label. Magical practitioner, witch, folk practitioner, whatever you want to call yourself is already a label, and you don't even need that. You really do not need to find a label, and you don't have to get into your practice and being like, okay, I am a water witch, or I am a divination witch, or anything like that. You really don't need that. The chances that this will be helpful for you are very slim, but the chances that you will limit your practice with it are very high. So what I would recommend you do is just jump into whatever you feel is interesting. Try different things, try different practices, try ceremonial magic, try witchcraft, try some kind of folk magic, try whatever you want. Of course, keep in mind closed practices, but I will get into that later. But apart from that, try out different things. The more things you try, the faster you will find what you really like. You will at some point find a niche that you like. And as soon as you are there, you already have found your label and your niche. And that is how it should, in my opinion, organically go. You should intuitively see what you like to do and not limit yourself, instead of giving yourself a label right away because it sounds cool or it seems like it's something that you would align with, and then niching yourself down to those kinds of practices. I feel like this is kind of obvious, but I still see a lot of comments and DMs by people saying like, I'm a new practitioner, but I don't know which practice to go into. I really want to find like a label or a practice, but I don't know which one I should pick. And yeah, that is the point. You don't have to pick one. In my opinion, as a beginner, you shouldn't pick one. It will come to you organically. You will find by trying things out the practices that you like, and then at some point you will have a name for what you're doing. And even if you don't, that's totally fine. My practice doesn't have a name. Whenever someone asks me what kind of magic I practice, the only thing I can really say it's some kind of low magic, and I get my inspiration from pre-Christian Scandinavia as well as Scandinavian folk magic. That's what I can say, but I don't have a label, and I don't think you need one. But since I already have an entire video on that topic that you can of course watch if you want to, let us continue with the next tip. And that is also kind of revolving around how to find the practice that you feel best with. And that is research about the folk magic of your ancestors. I would have loved to know about folk magic much earlier in my journey. I only learned about it like 4 years in, 5 years in or something. So all of that time before that, it was always just like modern witchcraft, Wicca-y things that I was exposed to, and that was not really something that I really aligned with. But folk magic and like in general low magic is where it's at for me. The problem is that A lot of the witchcraft books that you will find out there are very, very Wicca heavy, or at least practices that have derived from Wicca and from ceremonial practices. And they have, like, a lot of them have gotten like a more low magic twist, but still a lot of them are very, very Wicca-y. So if you only read those books, that leads to you not even being really aware about folk magic. But in my experience, so many people feel best practicing the magic, the folk magic of their ancestors. So a lot of people would have probably had a much easier time if they had found out and learned about folk magic much earlier, me included. So my tip would be, if you are a beginner, don't just read like the typical witchcraft books, but also read up about folklore and folk magic of your ancestors. And I know that's not as easy because, as I said, there are not a lot of books about it, especially if where you're from is like a smaller country. And maybe you don't speak the language of that country, then it can be very hard to find sources. But trust me, it's worth it to dig deep. So yeah, that is my second point. Make sure to learn about the folk magic and the folklore of your ancestors. If you find out that it is not for you, so be it. Then feel free to just do whatever else you like. But I find that a lot of practitioners really love getting into the magic of their ancestors, so this is what I would advise every beginner to dig into. Next up, we are getting a little bit more practical, because my third tip is find out what the clear sense is that works best for you, and do that early on. I hear from so many people that they don't really know how to communicate with spirits, and they have a hard time knowing what they're really doing when doing spell work because they can't really perceive the energies. I hear that a lot, and you can prevent that problem if you find out about the one clear sense that works best for you right away. In my opinion, that should be one of the first things that you do when you're starting out as any kind of magical practitioner, because your clairsenses, being able to pick up on energy, being able to either see it, feel it, hear it, whatever you want to do or whatever the thing is that works for you, being able to do that right away, it is such a fundamental skill. You need it for spirit communication, which of course is very, very important for a lot of people. So being able to pick up on their energy, feel them, see them, hear them, whatever, is very, very important. And it's also like a fundamental skill for spell work, because otherwise you are kind of practicing blindly because you're not really sure what you're doing, like where is the energy going, what is happening, is there even energy here? But if you're able to see it, or to feel it or something like that, then you can be sure of what you're doing. So this will most probably boost your spell work a lot, simply because you know where the energy is going, if what you are trying to do is actually working. So in my opinion, this is a fundamental skill that everyone should at least attempt to do. I mean, if you find out that nothing really works for you, then so be it. But in my opinion, most people have one clear sense that works really well for them. It's not always visualization though, and that is also a thing. A lot of books rely heavily on visualization, but if visualization is not something that's easy for you, you will have to substitute it with something else. So for me, for example, I can visualize, but it's not my strongest skill. Definitely my strongest skill is feeling energy. So whenever I do a spell or an exercise in a book or something and it asks for visualization, most of the time I will substitute the visualization part with feeling the energy. If you don't really know what works for you and you find out you can't visualize, how are you supposed to do like the exercises and the spells and whatever asks for visualization? But if you know what works for you, you have a much easier time just substituting the visualization part for something else. Next up, tip number 4, in my opinion, is also a fundamental skill, and that is learning how to do energy work. First of all, I want to mention I have a video on that, so if you're interested, then go watch that. Energy work. It is such a fundamental skill. I kind of feel like your psychic senses, being able to pick up on the energy, and being able to manipulate the energy, they go hand in hand, and these two are fundamental skills for spell work. If you don't know how to manipulate energy, how to raise it, like raise your own energy, how to channel an outside source of energy and how to channel it somewhere else into an object or something, or how to release it, then spell work will get very tricky for you. So in my opinion, these two things should be the first things that you learn. And there are like a million different techniques that you can use. In my opinion, you also shouldn't like find one technique that works and then settle with that, but try various different techniques. There are a lot of books that talk about it. Basically, every book has like this one section where it talks about psychic senses and energy manipulation, because it's such a basic skill, as I said. So there are a million techniques out there. Everyone does it at least like slightly different, I feel. So don't settle with one technique. Like, don't learn the first technique in the first book that you learn and settle with that. Try out different ones, because you never know if there's something else out there that works easier for you or better for you or more efficiently. And yeah, then you will find the technique that works best for you. I think my point here is, don't read about it in a book, think, oh, I know how it works, done, but really try it. I know we're all lazy sometimes and we don't necessarily always want to do the exercises in books, but when it comes to energy manipulation and channeling and raising and everything around that, it is important, because it is a fundamental skill for any kind of spell work. So please do the exercises, find out which technique works for you, and then practice it. And while we're talking about practicing, my fifth tip right away: don't think you have to read a million books before hopping into actual practice. In my opinion, it's not necessary to read a million books before you actually try something out. I know there's a lot of fear-mongering out there about people saying like, oh, my spell backfired so heavily, I cast a money spell and then someone died or something like that. But it's really not that bad. As long as you don't try your hands on baneful magic first or something, it's fine. Like, do a money spell, it's fine. Do a spell for self-confidence, it's fine. Like, this whole backfiring thing is such a huge case of fear-mongering, because in my opinion and in my experience, the worst thing that usually happens is that it doesn't work. And if I could travel back in time to myself when I was a beginner, that is definitely the one thing that I would have told my past self. Because in the beginning, wow, I was such an armchair witch, because I was so fascinated by all of these concepts. I had never heard about anything like that. So I was so fascinated, I wanted to read all the books. And of course, there's nothing wrong with reading books. But what I'm getting at is, please don't just read the books, also practice. Because it is equally, if not more important, to make your own experiences, to commune with spirits, and to find out how communication works for you, to try out spell work, see which herbs you feel good, and which, I don't know, if you want to work with crystals, which crystals feel good, to try out different types of divination techniques and everything like that. The actual practice is, in my experience, more important than books, because you will find very quickly that if you have read one Witchcraft 101 book, you have usually read them all. There are not that many groundbreaking Witchcraft 101 books. Of course, there are more books nowadays on different kinds of practices, and it's fun to read them, but pretty quickly they will get very repetitive. Don't think you have to read a million books before practicing. Please, just jump into it, just try things out. It's not like the world will explode when you make a mistake. The worst thing that can happen is that it doesn't work. And the best thing that you can do is just try different spells and record which of them worked and which of them didn't, because then you will find out what works for you. And in the end, that is much more important than whatever a book says. All right, my next tip number 6, is to not rely on magical herbal correspondences books when it comes to working with herbs. These correspondences books. I know they are nice and very convenient because then you can just look up herbs by correspondences and throw things together. But in my experience it's much more efficient and much more satisfying also to find your own correspondences and your own connections to the plants that you work with, especially to find them outside while they are still growing. I also have an entire video on that topic, how to connect with plant spirits and find out what you can work on with them. But to make it very short, these correspondence books, they come from other people's practices. They are other people's UPG, sometimes also SPG, shared personal gnosis. So I don't want to say that they are bullshit or anything like that. Not at all. I have used them also successfully. But as I already said, in my experience, it's much more productive, efficient to connect with the plant and to find out what you can use it for by yourself and intuitively. And there are like a million ways to do that. What I'm getting at here is you do not need these correspondences books. As soon as you have figured out how to intuitively connect to an energy, how to maybe communicate with a spirit, how to sense an energy basically, you will be able to do this by yourself. So basically just sit with a plant, maybe give it a small offering, connect to its spirit, sense its energy. You can do that intuitively. You don't necessarily have to properly communicate with the plant spirit, but you can also just pick up on its energy intuitively. For example, also by looking at it, the way that it's growing, the way that it's behaving. Does it wear fruits or not? Like, does it have any specific behavioral patterns? So for example, something that I've recently thought about is, I think they are called touch-me-nots. They are plants that have these seed pods that explode when you touch them. So things like that, like special behavioral patterns. You can also smell the plant, like does it have a sweet smell? Does it smell more fresh or more spicy? Look at different parts of the plant, how these look, the colors of the plant, the shape of the plant, of the leaves, of the flowers. So definitely look into the doctrine of signature, because that will help you a lot when it comes to that. And that is something that basically everyone uses around the board to kind of figure out correspondences. You can also, of course, that's very fun, learn about the folklore of the plant. Folk names will be very handy, very useful, because a lot of the times these folk names for plants will display what they were used for example. So folklore, folk names of the plants. You can also dive into their medicinal properties. So if they are used medicinally, then you can kind of reverse engineer how you could use these same properties in a magical, energetical sense. So there are a million ways that you can figure out how you can use a plant in your practice without having to look at a magical correspondence book. And the nice thing about it is, while you're trying to figure all of this out, you are forming an intuitive connection to this plant, which in turn makes spell work and in general any kind of work with that plant much more successful. It is definitely worth investing that time. In my experience, the more time you invest in something, the more successful it will be for you. And if you only look at a correspondence book and throw things together, you don't have a connection to those plants. That's just my personal experience and my personal opinion. But yeah, in my experience and in my opinion, it's definitely worth doing the work, especially because then you know why these things are used in the way that they are used, or why these plants have these correspondences. A lot of the times these correspondence books and lists are just like plant correspondences, period. Sometimes there's a little bit of folklore in there, or like how to use these plants, but then a lot of the times they don't even mention which areas of the world this folklore comes from, like mixing different folklore from different cultures, not even mentioning which country it's from, for example, and not really explaining why these correspondences are listed the way that they are. So yeah, doing the work yourself, definitely worth it. Oh, and by the way, by doing that, you will also find that you don't have to buy herbs anywhere, because you will find that you have everything you need right outside your house. And that's also very, very nice, saves a lot of money. And that is actually also the next point that I wanted to talk about. Tip number 7, you don't have to buy all of the herbs, crystals, candles from shops. You really do not need them. I know they are fancy, they look nice, everyone else has them. Like, for example, 7-day glass candles, like they are not really accessible in Germany. So for a long time I was always like lusting after them. I was always like, I want these nice 7-day glass candles, they are so cool. I want all of these figure candles, we don't have them here. But in the end, you really don't need them. I already talked about the plants because, well, you have all of the herbs you need right outside your door. You don't need crystals. Like, crystals are more of a modern thing to use, especially in the way that we use them now. Very, very early on, it was more of a thing of, this crystal has this color, so I'm using it for this. But you also don't need crystals. You can use stones. And if you don't want to do that, you don't even need any kind of stone or crystal or anything like that to work. You can use tea light candles from the shop. You don't need fancy, colorful, expensive candles. And that comes from a witchy shop owner. So if I say you don't need all of that stuff, that is probably correct. In my opinion, and also in my experience, the less you buy and also the less you work off of other people's correspondences, the more intuitive you get, the better you get at connecting with spirits of stones, of the land, of plants or whatever, and the more skilled you get at being able to interpret the landscape, where something's growing, where you found a stone, the way a stick looks. And that is very, very cool, because at some point you will be basically completely reliant only on yourself. You will not need anything else. Of course, if you want to use candles, then you will probably buy candles. But like, apart from that, there's really not a lot that you have to buy. And I mean, you don't even have to work with candles if you don't want to. Like, you can have a very, very, very successful magical practice with only using the things that you find around you in nature. And I think that is very, very cool. Right now, because of how social media works, everything has gotten a little bit aesthetics heavy, which I don't mind because I am a maximalist and I really, really like aesthetics. So there's nothing wrong with buying things. If you can afford it, do it. Why not? The only thing that I want to get at is you don't have to do it. And if you're a beginner seeing all of these fancy things that everyone seems to have, just rest assured that you do not need it. All right, after a little break, because my camera was overheating, let's move on to my tip number 8. And that is, don't listen to people making up rules about magical practices. Again, I already have an entire video ranting about that topic, so if you're interested, check that out. But yeah, in any kind of magical practice community, there will be people trying to make themselves seem better and bigger and more valid, especially in front of beginners, by trying to create some kind of rule that doesn't make sense. And it's usually a rule that they, of course, follow, though, so they are better than you who doesn't follow it. Typical examples for that most of us probably know are, you have to get your tarot deck as a gift, otherwise it won't work, or you cannot share a photo of your altar online, or otherwise it will lose all its power, things like that. There are a lot of these people out there who try to make up rules. I also saw people making up weird rules about how to make bind runes, even though we have literally no historical source on how bind runes were created. Yeah, there are a lot of those people out there. If you see someone trying to make up a rule, please cross-reference them, think logically about it, and don't just pick it up as a fact. There are a lot of opinions out there, a lot of people with a lot of opinions and a lot of experiences, but these rules a lot of the times are just that, people's experience. Or just people's opinions, sometimes not even their experience. I can't really believe that people actually bought tarot decks and then didn't have any success with it. Please think logically when someone comes at you being like, but you have to get your tarot deck as a gift, otherwise it won't work. think logically. Does that really make sense? Does that intuitively click with you? If not, just discard it as a random rule that someone made up that is not a fact. In fact, magical practices have actually very, very little rules, and it should stay that way. But apparently a lot of people come to any kind of magical practice from, I was about to say Christianity, and in a lot of cases it is Christianity, but probably also other kinds of religions that have a lot of rules. And I don't know, maybe these people think they need some kind of framework to work in, so they make up rules. Or I don't know why, but they seem to not be able to shed the idea of having like a million rules to adhere to. The fact is, in magical practices, we don't really have a lot of rules. So if someone comes at you trying to persuade you that there is this one specific thing that you have to do or that you cannot do, think logically about it and cross-reference it. Ask other practitioners or look it up in books or on the internet. Most probably you will find either a lot of other sources saying the same thing, or you will find sources saying this is bullshit, or you will find nothing about it. And if you find nothing about it, if you research it, this is making it very, very clear that this person made it up. So please just don't let other people confuse you, because it's your magical practice and not theirs. And while we are already talking about cross-referencing, my tip number 9, do not settle with modern witchcraft books. I know there are a million fancy Witchcraft 101 books out there. The publishers come out with so many books. Basically any kind of content creator has written a book on it. There are a million beginner books, like so many beginner books. But please don't just settle with those. One, I already said, they get very repetitive very quickly. You will buy like 10 books and maybe 2 would have sufficed, because the other 8 just regurgitate whatever other books have already said. So there is a lot of this regurgitating like general information and very little new information. Get a good beginner's book instead of like 10 or 15. Also, modern witchcraft books have this problem, and I know, yes, it's getting better, but it's not where I would like it to be yet. Modern witchcraft books have this problem where historical accuracy is not really a thing. Like, if modern witchcraft books have like a history section on like the history of witchcraft and things like that, a lot of the times those sections are not very accurate. They are a lot of the times very insufficiently researched. So yeah, historical accuracy in witchcraft books, not the best. So I would advise you, 1, to definitely read books about witchcraft and its history. So read, for example, anthropology books about different magical practices, and read history books about witchcraft, about the cunning folk, about the witchcraft persecutions, everything like that. Because if you read those, you will spot the misinformation in other books, like the modern witchcraft books. So I think it's very, very important for beginners to read history books about the history of witchcraft, especially about the history of our modern witchcraft practice. Read books on how the Golden Dawn were created, where those came from. Read up about how Wicca came to be, how traditional witchcraft came to be, everything like that. One book that I find excellent for that is The Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. It goes over the entire history of modern witchcraft, and it makes you realize how much misinformation is actually in modern witchcraft books, and it enables you to spot a lot of those misinformations. So this book is amazing for cross-referencing. I know it's a long book and it's not necessarily the most enjoyable book to read because it is a history book and it has over 500 pages. It is a little bit challenging going through it, but I think it's so important. In my opinion, every modern witchcraft practitioner should read that book. And yeah, that being said, I think it is very, very important to learn about Wicca. Even if you are not interested in it, I think it's very important to know what it is made up of, like the practices that go into it and What actually is Wicca and what is more of a modern interpretation of it? A lot of modern witchcraft books are very, very Wicca influenced. And if you know the practices that make up Wicca, you will spot these things, and then you can make an educated decision on if you want to practice like that or not. I feel like nowadays so many modern witchcraft practices are so Wicca heavy simply because so many modern witchcraft books are like 90% Wicca but don't say so. So knowing where this information and these practices come from will enable you to make an educated decision on if you want to practice those or not. And then also, if you have already found like a niche of witchcraft that you want to go into, and maybe it is the witchcraft or the magical practice, the folk magic of one specific culture or country, then make sure to research this culture or this country's folklore and also their history. Read archaeological books about it, read historical books about it, read their folklore, everything like that. That will help you out so much more than reading a modern witchcraft book on, I don't know, Slavic witchcraft. You will probably learn more by doing that research yourself. And then lastly, my tip number 10, I think is very, very important nowadays, that spiritual practices are getting more and more widely accepted and it's getting more trendy. And that is learn about closed practices and cultural appropriation. There is a lot of cultural appropriation out there. A lot of things are very widely known and talked about a lot, like using white sage, for example, or like dream catchers. A lot of practices by Native American tribes that are appropriated left and right. So a lot of things you will find very, very easily, and those are also picked up by some modern witchcraft books and talked about, so that is nice. But knowing about the entire concept and knowing about which practices you are welcome to dive into and which you have to be initiated into is very, very important, especially if you think about the first tip that I gave you to dive into different kinds of practices and try things out. Of course, you have to know which ones you are allowed to dive into without an initiation or without a specific heritage, and which ones you aren't, which ones are closed practices. Knowing about cultural appropriation, in my opinion, it's very important. I would have loved to have learned about it earlier on. In Germany, in the like spiritual realms, it's not talked about a lot yet. A lot of people are still like, cultural appropriation doesn't exist, we are only culturally appreciating, and it doesn't hurt anyone if I use white sage, blah, blah, blah. This topic is not talked about a lot yet in every kind of culture. It's definitely not picked up by enough books yet. So you will have to learn about it by yourself so that you can spot books that are culturally appropriating, or you can spot creators that are culturally appropriating, or shops that do that. Because one example is basically every fucking esoteric or witchcraft shop in Germany sells white sage. So I am always like, well, I don't want to buy from you now. You are selling white sage. That's fucked. I don't like that. Or you are selling dream catchers or whatever. So being able to spot those and just being able to, again, make an educated decision on if you want to support them or not is very important in my experience. So not only is it important to be able to know which practices you're allowed to practice and which ones you're welcome in and which you aren't, but also to be able to differentiate between creators, shops, books that you want to support or not. All right, and with that being said, those were my 10 tips for beginner magical practitioners or witches. I kind of feel like these make sense for all magical practitioners, not only witches. If you are also a more advanced practitioner, feel free to give your tips, your advice in the comments so that every beginner here can just continue reading in the comments. As always, let's do a little Patreon and YouTube member shout out. Thank you so much to Linda, The Other Saffron, Orchis Studio, Silent Selena, Richard Standing Fox, Ryan, Alex Jazz, Naomi, Shaw, Christiana, T Demon, Elizabeth, Sylvia, Weir Festira, Katrina, V, Bella, Derek, Smiley, Kirsten, Shannon, Andrew, Tisha, Sarah, Aziza, Carrie, August, Hannah, Shelby, Helena, SJ, Merle N. Kate Cade, Z. Kent Brittany Emre Celine Smoketa Josh Elinora Knarr, Kristony Rixie Business Annalena Svenna Ashley, Tim John Phoenix Jenny Maggie Misty Amy, Bethany Timothy Coffee, or the Honorary Gossip Squirrel, and Bjorn, and my lovely YouTube members Marianne, Betsy, Peony Rain, Milla, and KT. Thank you so much for your support. As always, I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe and give a thumbs up and ring the bell down below so you're notified whenever I upload a new video. Feel free to check out my other socials and my online shop for ethically and sustainably sourced witchy wares. And if you want to support me in another way, then feel free to check out my Patreon or my YouTube membership. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!